You're doing this interview in the most Wisconsin way possible in the front seat of your car. Looks like
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Are you in Milwaukee? It's kind of cold out,
I am in
mildly
Milwaukee.
cold. Are
I'm
you?
at I'm at Lake Park Bistro. Lake
Are you?
Park. Yeah, I wrote a whole book in this parking lot.
I was gonna say that's the most appropriate place to do it. Wait, you actually wrote the book there?
This Phosphorus book. Yeah, most of it. Um, yeah, because I was doing it in the middle of COVID, and I've got four kids and not a very big house, and then we got a COVID dog, and my wife works for the DNR, and she was working from home, so we have an extra minivan, and I just started taking it down to the park every day, and old habits die hard. So yeah, and the kids are home. The kids don't have school today, and my wife's working at home, so I ended up coming back here.
Nice, nice. Did you go there to write it? It was sort of out of necessity, but you could have picked a million different spots along the lake to write it. And so, why did you choose that?
Oh, it's just a beautiful park. But I have, I worked at the Journal Sentinel for a couple of decades, and I made the break completely a couple of years ago. I mean, it's kind of complicated because I was working for UWM. The UWM was paying the paper, so I was technically employed by the paper. But anyway, I bring this up because I haven't been going into an office for probably 4 or 5 years, and I picked up some pretty weird work habits with the Great Lakes book. One time I was headed down to UWM. I live up in Whitefish Bay on the bus, and I just got sucked into something, and I just kept riding the bus. I thought, oh, I'll just take it all the way out to the airport. And I got to the airport, and they have those massage chairs. They don't have them
Yeah.
anymore. But I was like, this is perfect. So I set myself up in the massage chair and started going there 2 or 3 times a week. And I didn't really mention it to my wife because she didn't really need to know. But one time she called, and there's the airline voice, going over the announcements, and she's like, "What the hell?" And I'm like, "Well, I go down to the airport sometimes, especially in the winter, because it's got that atrium, it's well lit."
Yeah, yeah.
And she's like, "All right, just don't get on a plane." And then I was like, "That's not a bad idea either." But,
How
yeah,
far are
so
we going to
I've been
take this spa experience?
right. So yeah, I've been working in weird places. Like the newsroom was never really a comfortable place to write and work, but that made you got comfortable with it. So I don't mind putting myself in a little bit of an uncomfortable situation because it can help you concentrate. So
Yeah, that is interesting. Finding sort of the ways into the mind. Like there's sometimes where if I'm stuck on something, I have to literally. I remember this one time I was starting a new tour and I had probably like 40 minutes of material. I need another 20 minutes of material, and it was like the last night. And I was walking right along the lake shore, right along the park by the big red lighthouse,
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
while I was walking, I wrote like I wrote that bit, which was like giving me hell for like, I don't know, like a week, but it was that idea of moving or doing something different than just sitting there staring at a screen, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
What is you've written extensively about the Great Lakes, about the damage humans have done to it, and where did all of this like start? Where'd this fuel come from in your life? Was there a moment from your childhood where you became sort of dedicated to journalism and environmentalism, or has it always sort of been brewing?
Well, I kind of had a moment almost at the same place that you had yours down on the lakefront. So I was born in Green Bay and went to high school there, went to college over in Michigan, and after college, headed out west. And I went to Sun Valley, Idaho first, and I got a job at the newspaper out there. And from there, I went to Idaho Falls and then Salt Lake City, and it took about 10 years. And then we had our first kid and kind of felt the tug of home. So I took a job at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and I was a feature writer when they hired me. And one of the first stories I did came from a walk along the lakefront with my daughter, who was like she was like barely a year old, And so I'd been out in Idaho covering all these natural resource issues, which I wasn't trained to do. I had a degree in history. I just kind of learned on the job, but I learned a lot about salmon living in Idaho. And so we moved back here. I moved back here with a little trepidation because I really liked the West and the openness and the mountains and the sunshine in the winter. Um, but I also like the culture of Wisconsin, and my family's here, and I've learned to really love Milwaukee. Put that aside, I'm walking with my daughter, and it's salmon spawning season in Milwaukee, and all the fish were coming into McKinley Marina to spawn. And so I remember having this feeling like, wow, at least they're not counting salmon on single hands. I mean, in Idaho, there's the sockeye, Snake River sockeye salmon. And the first year I was covering them, one fish made it back to its spawning grounds at Redfish Lake. And it's still on life support, the whole program. They just stripped it of its milt and put it into a captive breeding program. And so it was kind of nice when I was down at the lake with my daughter thinking, well, she's going to grow up in a place where there's oodles of salmon. I didn't know much about the history of the salmon stocking program and how it's really pretty much an artificial fishery. But some of the fishermen that day, I said, what are they doing? They were like finning their way up the boat ramps, like always swimming upstream, it's really weird. And I said, are they spawning? They're like, oh, they don't spawn. They're just born to be caught. It's a catch and what do they call it? Put and take. Largely. I mean, that's oversimplifying it. But I went back to the newsroom and I mentioned this to my editor, who actually also happened to be from Green Bay. And he said, well, everybody knows the history of the salmon program. And he's 10 years older than I am. I'm 55 now, but I was probably 35 then. So he was 45, and people 45 and under were really too young to understand what happened to the lakes in the 50s and 60s. So he kind of poo-pooed it, and I kept thinking about it, and I went back to him a few weeks later and said, well, why don't we do like a big feature story on, just the history of the salmon program? And he said, well, if you're going to do that, you got to start at the beginning. Like, what were the lakes like before whites arrived? And that launched me on this Great Lakes episode era in my career. So
yeah, and that book, which I've been reading over the past couple weeks, it just does a fantastic job of showing, I mean, as the title suggests, the death and the life of the Great Lakes. But we have this incredible natural resource, one of the most unique on the planet. And, eventually it gets opened up through the St. Lawrence Seaway to greater commerce and connecting it to the rest of the world. People got caught up thinking like, Chicago could be not the second city, but the first city, because the only reason people go to New York is they have to stop there, that being the thought process. But we see really in this book kind of a microcosm for almost every environmental issue, even the ones going on today with climate change, is that people will trade near-term, short-term economic gain or the prospect of it for the health of something long-term, sometimes intentionally, and sometimes because they do not know the consequences of the things that they do. And did you, in doing that, that was a long lead up to my question, do you believe that people do adverse economic things largely in spite of the consequences that they know will happen? Or do they not know the full impact, the full consequences of what they do?
That's a good question. And it's probably both. I mean, there's trade-offs to everything. If we're going to have a civilization, we're going to have to grow food, and we're going to have to chop down some trees to create these pastures. There's always going to be a cost to any kind of economic enterprise,
right?
But I think things really got out of hand in the Great Lakes back in the 50s and the 60s. I mentioned I grew up in Green Bay, and the Fox River, the northeastern Wisconsin Fox River, flows right through the heart of Green Bay, and that is one of the most industrialized river corridors that you'll find anywhere. I mean, at one point, I think it had like 25 or 30 paper or pulp mills on the riverbanks between Appleton and Green Bay. And so I was born in 1967, well before the Clean Water Act kicked in. And, when I was huck finning down by the shoreline or the riverbank as a kid with my friends and brothers. My parents were horrified, and it wasn't that they were worried that their 8-year-old, 9-year-old kids were going to drown. It's that we were going to just get poisoned, and it was like playing at the dump. We used to pick little nuggets of sulfur off the riverbank in De Pere, Wisconsin, and bring it home and light it like some kind of low-grade firework because it would melt and ooze, and it just stunk like sulfur. And it was like, I remember thinking, wow, this is nature's bounty.
Yeah.
It's golden clumps along the riverbank, and it's actually a byproduct of the pulp making process. And so, yeah, it was, environment be damned in northeastern Wisconsin for years and years and years. And what we've demonstrably turned a corner when I don't know if you've ever seen these pictures of like walleye derbies on the Fox River just below the De Pere Dam. You could walk across the river there, which is probably a quarter mile wide, just on boats. I mean, there's just, and that was not the case back in 1978 or whenever I was mucking around down there. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I do think we know that there's consequences. I don't think we always grasp them, and that's human nature. But I think with the damning thing is once we realize what we're doing and we keep doing it or do more of it, that's when you get a little dispirited. Because like with this Great Lakes book, I tried not to paint any villains. I tried to put everybody in their context and the decisions they were making at the time, and they made sense. But at some point, it became clear that the Seaway, which opened up the Great Lakes to all manner of invasive species and biological mischief, once we realized what was happening there, and we weren't doing anything or enough to stop it, that's when some fingers can start to get pointed, and that's what journalism does. And so that's
and sort of just to set this up for the audience who may not have read the book or may not know much of anything of this, can you just give a brief synopsis of the St. Lawrence Seaway and what impact opening it up had on a body of water, that being the Great Lakes, that holds 20% of the world's fresh water?
Yeah. So when you look at a map or a globe, you see this blob in the middle of North America, which is the blue blob, the Great Lakes. And then there's like this tendril stretching out to the North Atlantic, and that's the St. Lawrence Seaway. So on a map or a globe, it looks like there's a straight shot from the East Coast into the middle of the continent. And there was for things moving out of the lakes, but things couldn't move into the lakes because that river flowing out to the ocean in its natural state was just a torrent. And anything that could swim in from, far eastern Canada, once it'd be smooth sailing until you got to Niagara or to Montreal, and then the rapids start. And then if you were to even make it up the river in its wild state, you'd hit a wall literally at Niagara Falls. Right. So these ponds, these oversized ponds, these Great Lakes, in a real way were as isolated from the rest of the aquatic world as like a Northwoods pond, spring-fed pond, because nothing could come in. On the backside, there was, they call it a subcontinental divide, but there was a hump in the landscape which separated the waters of the Mississippi from the Great Lakes. So there was a front door and a back door that we opened. The front door would be the St. Lawrence Seaway, and what that really was just taming the river and building a system of locks. So it was like a giant nautical elevator for huge boats. It's a lift system to bring them up and around Niagara Falls and onward to Chicago, Duluth, Milwaukee, pick your city. The problem was, and we opened up the biggest, most recent version of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959, is that these boats carried with them in their ballast tanks, when ballast tanks are used to steady boats on the open ocean if they're not completely balanced, and they're never really completely balanced, or rarely with their cargoes. So it's like it's a navigation management tool that's critical. If it goes wrong, I have an example in the book of a passenger boat in Chicago just rolling over, and killed, like, it's the Eastland disaster, killed like 800 people. So ballast water is it's like wing flaps for a plane. They're essential. But they're not, the water isn't dead weight. It's carrying whatever these ships might have picked up anywhere on the globe and then dropping it in the lakes. And because the lakes are relatively new, they're only about 10,000 years old, which is just a tick of the clock, geologically speaking, and isolated, they really had no defense system built in. So all these, it just so happened that the Caspian Sea basin is a very, very old uh, water system. And it's got extreme swings in temperature and salinity and even water levels. So I used to like to think about it. I was trying to explain it to somebody who doesn't like reading about ecology. And I might be one of those people from time to time. But
Yeah.
it's like the Caspian Sea is like the SEC. If you can win the SEC, you're going to go to town. And if you can make it in the Caspian Sea and then you get out and you take on another water body system, you're going to do pretty well. And that's unfortunately what happened with the Great Lakes. That's how we got zebra mussels and quagga mussels, and round gobies, and oh gosh, I can't remember, but a bunch. But nothing's been more disruptive than the zebra and quagga mussels.
Yeah, and I think everybody who's swam in Wisconsin lakes knows about them. They're the small, hard muscles that attach to everything that cut your foot. I remember, growing up taking the dock out in Lake Winnebago at my grandparents' deal, and every stanchion of pier was full of them. You're walking around, you cut your feet on them. They're on everything. You pull muscles up, they're on those. So.
Yeah, let me just jump in real quickly.
Yeah.
Gets to the economic question that you just asked. So you think about that. Those mussels weren't there in the 80s. They didn't really show up in the Lake Michigan area until late 80s, early 90s, and then they spread inland. And so you think about, you can no longer swim at off your grandparents' dock unless you wear aqua socks, or you just don't swim, or you get used to. I've talked to a lot of people who've got infections and they have to take antibiotics. So this is a real cost to everyday people that is just vast. I mean, it's across the whole Great Lakes and beyond. I mean, these mussels are now found in 30 some states in the US. But it's so diffuse and dispersed. So just what you're talking about right there has a cost. You would have a hard time quantifying it. But now extrapolate that out to the 30 million people who live in the Great Lakes Basin. At the same time, the shipping industry, which benefits very much from this, it's very, very small. But the economic rewards are huge. So they have a real incentive to keep the status quo, while all of us are just kind of, walking around with bloody feet and just thinking this is just the cost of doing business. So that just reminded me when you were bringing up your story, thinking, yeah, these are economic costs that don't get tallied often enough.
Yeah, and I almost think the zebra mussel is like, I said microcosm before, but I'll say again, it's a microcosm for, what we deal with. And the story you wrote is sort of it shows how we deal with environmental concerns, period, in this world. Like, I think the best example is you were talking about Lake Mead and how the mussels were clogging and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but the mussels were clogging the filtration or the draining in Lake Mead, causing really billions of dollars over time in damage. And the reason those are there is because of this ballast water that they ask these ships to, it's kind of like when you take a boat out from a boat landing, they ask you to like make sure there's no invasive species on it before putting in another thing. They ask these big ships to change their ballast water with the salt water that doesn't contain as many of these. And if they didn't do it, the fine was $3,000, $3,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you're talking multi-billions of dollars of damage and a $3,000 fine. And
and so we checked these freighters as they come in up the St. Lawrence Seaway at Lake Mead and Lake Powell in Nevada and Utah. They check boaters as they go to the boat ramps, and if you've been in a state that's infested, they demand that you get the hull scrubbed with a scalding water. They were washing swimming noodles when I was there, because the spores for these mussels could get in there. And people who dodged these checkpoints, there was like this jet skier. He lived in Page, Arizona. Everybody knew that his jet ski never left Page, Arizona. It wasn't going to go over to the Caspian Sea and pick up some mussels. He got caught avoiding one of the checkpoints to, I think it was Lake Powell, and he got like a $5,000 fine compared to a ship that can hold millions of gallons of water and has been over, to the Caspian Sea basin. They get a $3,000 fine. That's what it just doesn't make sense. And that's, I guess, the role of the journalist is to just open people's eyes.
Yeah, I mean, because I continue to feel like we, as people, are just paying the price for, bigger companies who can just afford to make and create anything from PFAS to phosphorus, as you talk. We'll get to in a second, but these big high dollar things, it's almost like they're like, let's make as much money as we can. And sometimes even having the information that this is detrimental to people or these chemicals never go away or whatever. And then by the time the laws and our buddies in political offices will stop, can't do anything, and people will finally point to us, we'll have made billions and then we'll pay millions in fines. So it's almost like a business model, which is the most frustrating thing for, someone like me who's just watching it.
Yeah, I agree. And, the shipping industry is doing a lot more than they were at the time that I wrote the book. And, I wouldn't ever want to see the boats completely go away unless the problem, kicks up again. We start getting different types of invasive species. Then I think, and it's tricky because we manage and own the St. Lawrence Seaway and the channels and locks and canals with Canada. So, we can't just unilaterally, although we might be able to, just shut the door. But yeah, I mean, it is frustrating when you just see this wanton abuse just go unchecked, and then when people figure out the extent of the problem, it's the people who are left to pay for it, and that's a drag.
Well, and if the St. Lawrence Seaway really made the economic impact they thought it would, I think it's almost like an easier argument. But isn't it true that, that as soon as they started opening up the St. Lawrence Seaway, there were rules in place to not have it be wider, so certain ships could not get in there. They were thereby limiting its economic viability, or did I?
No, that's pretty much it. I mean, what happened was the East Coast did not want to spend. I forgot what it cost, but it was if it wasn't $1 billion, it was close to it. And this is in $1950. They didn't want the competition from Chicago, as you were mentioning earlier, or any of the other Great Lakes cities. They didn't feel the need to have a port in the middle of a system of ports in the middle of the continent. They were happy to receive these goods and then ship them around the rest of North America. So they lobbied to keep the Seaway small when it was built. And then coincidentally and unfortunately, right when they were breaking ground on it, the first container ships started to sail. And those demanded bigger and bigger boats. So what we're left with really is kind of a narrow gauge railroad. It's just this quirky little, like the boats are huge when you see them. They're, 800 feet up, almost 800 feet long and 80 feet wide, but they're tiny, compared to modern shipping. And another problem with the Seaway is ice. Shipping demands just-in-time delivery these days, and you can't have a real viable navigation channel corridor for finished products if it's not going to be open 12 months a year. Because if you're trying to get Sony's into Chicago via ship, getting a great deal on it 9 months a year. Well, the 3 months that you can't sail these Sony's in, the railroads are going to kill you on the costs. They're going to be like, okay, now you're going to pay. And it works that way, not just for finished products, but for, components of things. So what the Seaway really does right now is it takes our grain out around the world, and it brings in primarily imported steel, which we can make here.
Right.
So.
Right. And so that's sort of the tale, a very super abridged tale of the Great Lakes. And I just want to kind of pivot, because you also mention it in that book, but then you wrote an entire other book on phosphorus, the devil's element. What is phosphorus, and where do we find it?
So phosphorus is like and I'm not a chemist or a biologist, but there are really three critical nutrients to a modern crop growing, and it's potassium, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And since the early 1900s, we've figured out how to pull the nitrogen that we want and need out of the air. It's the Haber-Bosch process. Potassium deposits are common in old seabeds, dried up seabeds, and there's plenty of them. And phosphorus is the bugaboo here because it's mostly tied up in rocks that are sedimentary rocks that are really just basically piles of old dead life. And so these rock deposits rich in phosphorus fuel our modern agriculture system, and we're starting to run low on them in the U.S. and in other places around the globe, and they're not spread evenly around the globe. And so, like 80% of the remaining phosphorus deposits, proven reserves, are in Morocco and the occupied territory of Western Sahara. And this is going to become a bigger deal as the decades click along here in this century, and it could lead to some real instability. But phosphorus, I mean, the rocks weren't always the only place we got phosphorus. Um, Early on, we were using bones. Like for this book, I went over to Waterloo one of the days that I wasn't in my minivan.
Yeah.
I made it to Belgium, and the battlefield of Waterloo, I think 40,000 people died in 11 hours or something, and the horses, and so a lot of bones piled up on that field. That isn't a whole lot bigger than a couple of golf courses. It's just amazing to see. But there are no bones there, and there haven't been any there since like the 1830s, because the English went over after the battle and stripped all the bones and ground them up in these special mills that they built and used it as crop fertilizer. They didn't know why it worked, but it turned out it was phosphorus in the bones, because phosphorus is in every single cell on Earth. Every living organism needs phosphorus, and it doesn't go away when the organism dies. As we found out, it gets piled up in these sedimentary rocks, but um, any living thing can be a great fertilizer. Almost any living thing for the next generation. It's the circle of life.
Yeah, that's my grandpa Bob would go fishing in like Winnebago and was notorious for he hated catching sheep's head. Just because, kid growing up at that, when he was growing up, it was all about the walleyes, and any sheep's head was just a problem for the walleyes. So he'd keep them and he'd bury them in his garden, and that's why he had these massive pumpkins, I think.
Yeah. I know. It's this whole thing, the whole story of phosphorus really is this. It's the circle of life, and then we crack that circle and turn it into a straight line with these mines, and so we're just pumping an enormous amount of phosphorus into the living world. And that's, overdosing our farmlands, and it's ending up in our waters. And that's why we get these toxic algae blooms all over the place. Like in Lake Mendota, you see that sitting on that patio of
the terrace. Yeah, over at the terrace. Yeah.
Yeah. And, there's a dock, and, at least in my mind, I remember seeing like, maybe a lifeguard there, but very few people, especially as you progress into July and August, are going into that water because it's goop too many days, unless the winds are really kicking up and stuff. But it's goop, and that's coming from farms, coming from the phosphorus running off of farm fields in the form of excess chemical fertilizer, or to a large extent Dane County manure. So,
and what is sort of the we have two things going on here. We have one currently that the runoff from these is creating these dead zones, is creating like a lot of you kind of see it even to when you're like just you see a small pond, it looks like you can walk right over it almost, it looks like it's the green of a golf course. Golf courses also contribute to this. What are the contributors? Farms, but what other things can contribute to increased phosphorus?
Well, it's mostly farms. I mean, I hate to say it, but so when we got the Clean Water Act in 1972, that really, cracked down on industry dumping whatever it wanted into the public waters. But there was an exemption, so they call that in regulatory parlance point source solution. Anything with a smokestack or a pipe you can plug or put on equipment to scrub with the pollution in that waste stream. But they gave agriculture a pass because it's so diffuse. It's just like you can't really squeegee farm field of its of its pesticides and excess nutrients. So it's just going to do what everything does, and that's flow downhill. And unfortunately, downhill means in this region the Great Lakes, and that's also a drinking water source for 30-40 million people. So there's no simple solutions, but we are giving agriculture largely a pass. And as these farms get bigger and bigger, people think the problem's becoming bigger and bigger and more unmanageable. But you could also make the argument that it's becoming less of a non-point source. I hate to use those words, but it's becoming more like a classic industry with a big sewage lagoon that you can get your hands on this now and treat it. And they're starting to do that. They're starting to strip methane out of some of the big dairies up in northeastern Wisconsin. And there's no reason they can't get at the nitrogen and the phosphorus that's in that waste stream as well, and repackage it and reuse it and try to stitch this circle of life back together a bit. It's largely an agriculture problem.
So what would be like for, let's say, I mean, we have farmers that listen to this podcast. What would be some ways that they can help with the phosphorus problem themselves?
Well, there's for years and years, these fertilizers were relatively cheap. They're getting more expensive, and they could get really expensive with what's going on in Ukraine and whatnot. But it was like an insurance policy for farmers to put down more than they needed just in case. And the consequences were, foul waters. So, and not the farmers, I don't want to disparage them. They're just operating in the system that we've set up, kind of like the shipping industry. Until we figure out the problem, then it's on the public. It's on an informed public to demand regulations, and regulations don't kill industry. I mean, you look at, I mentioned the Fox River and how heavily industrialized it was. Well, it still is, but there's fish in it now, and people are fishing for them. The regulations kind of, if they're applied appropriately, just it creates an even field. So maybe we end up paying more for milk if we start regulating farms more heavily. But we're already paying the price of cheap milk and not being able to swim in these ponds or these lakes like Mendota. That's a real cost, and it's not assessed. It's not on any ledger anywhere, but it's a huge cost. So, there are a lot of farmers doing everything they can, but collectively, to everything they can to be good stewards of the land. And they don't. You talk to any farmer, they don't see themselves as some kind of marauding, black-hatted dudes. They know landscapes and the land better than anybody, and they've got some real knowledge there, but they haven't been forced to treat their pollution stream as for what it is, which is just a heavy-duty pollutant. And that's when it's on an informed citizenry to lean on their lawmakers, their representatives, to get better regulations. So, yeah.
This is, I mean, it's tough, man. In both, both books that you wrote, you have, first of all, with the Great Lakes, you have invasive species, which, I mean, like you say in the book, you can see an oil slick. You can't see the mussels at the bottom of maybe if you're swimming in them, you're like, oh, it's a mussel, but it's alive and it's doing well. And you're like, this isn't bad, but it's this living, breathing oil slick, and in the case of phosphorus, it's, it becomes this thing of like, oh, you're one of those. Well, we're farmers. We're doing our best to do the thing. And what's so bad? It's a natural process. Sometimes you get a little more nutrients in the lake. This is what happens. I think it's easy. It's a difficult mind process to sort of wrap your head around. These living things create these other ecological problems. It's just not an intuitive thing for humans to say this is a problem,
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that I talk about in that Great Lakes book a lot is it's a biological pollution. And that doesn't make it any less noxious than anything you can imagine, any kind of industrial excrement coming out of a pipe into the Cuyahoga River in the 1960s. It is a real pollutant. And again, like it's the farmers are just operating in the system that has been set up, and the system is not working, manifestly so. When you just look at Lake Erie and Toledo lost its drinking water source because of toxic algae, because of phosphorus, because of runoff from farmlands primarily. For back in 2014, for like, I don't know, it was like 3 or 4 days for 500,000 people. And, the water was too poisonous to drink, and you couldn't boil it to make it safe because that only concentrated the toxin. And the toxin was a completely natural phenomenon, but that doesn't mean that it's not really, really bad stuff. And so, yeah, there aren't simple answers here. And if I have any goal with this phosphorus book, is just to get people to start seeing that, we really do need to manage this as best we can as a circle. Just recycle it. Just keep using it over and over again, because it doesn't stop fertilizing when it leaves a farm field. It'll just grow stuff that we don't want. And this algae is really toxic.
Yeah. So it's it is. You're kind of putting it out there to almost say, what solutions or methods can we come up with to make this more sustainable? Do you have like where is farming gonna go? As our climate changes. I've got a lot of friends that are farmers. I mean, they are changing their methods to get the same yields, and they're not saying it. They know it's not going to be sustainable, at least the fellows I'm thinking about right now. And they're wondering, what are they going to do? Now, are we going to take this indoor growing? Is it going to be like greenhouse type growing? Where do you see it going?
I don't know. I'm not a big thinker when I'm not writing a book.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm saying that kind of facetiously, but I really don't know. But I do know that our relationship with milk has changed a lot, and this is as anecdotal as you can get, but like my kids they drink oat milk, which, that's great. That's great for them, but it's just a different world. Because when I was growing up, I drank milk like it was, soft
water.
Drink.
Yeah.
It didn't even have flavor after a while. It was just what you drank. But the whole modern agriculture system is so twisted with the farm bill and the subsidies, and there's I don't have the number in front of me, but there was like some vast amount of cheese stored in warehouses all over the country because we put it into these blocks of like Velveeta type cheese to preserve the milk, because otherwise it's going to go bad, because we're making more milk than people are consuming. I mean, and that's a episodic problem. It's not always the case, but it's the case often enough that, that's where they used to, excuse me, the government cheese, the stuff that, they would just give out as just kind of a form of welfare. They don't do that so much anymore, but I don't know how they manage this stockpile of cheese, but it's clear that we've often got more milk than we need. And back during the pandemic, the lockdown, they were just dumping milk into the fields and letting it wash into the lakes. It was nuts.
Yeah, I mean, that was an issue of, I had some people on the podcast talking about that. That was more, I believe, an issue of you had to get it to a package. I forget the process, but the next line in that, they were gone. So you really had no option there.
No, they didn't. It wasn't their fault at all. It was just the idea that, like cows don't stop producing manure just because, there's not enough truckers to take it to, landfill.
Right.
They don't stop producing milk. And so, there was a choke point in the flow there, and it ended up with milk on the fields, which is, it's a bummer any way you look at that.
Yeah. So when it comes to like active, because we need farming, and we're not going to stop doing it, really. I think culturally speaking, especially in Wisconsin, I think milk has waned a little bit. I don't know if cheese, is going to have the same fate, I suppose. But is there a way that you see us doing the farming sustainably with phosphorus at all, or are we gonna have to find another?
No. We can't live without the phosphorus. It's just we've got to set up a system where instead of it just so often running off the farms into the streams down into the lake and poisoning the lakes, it gets captured along the way. And that's where, we're talking about these people call them mega farms, and the regulators call them concentrated animal feeding operations. But these supersized dairies, those aren't, a lot of environmentalists just get a knee jerk like that's bad, and it's bad in every way. And I think of it as like, well, no, that's good. Now that they've really got a bunch of manure in one place in these lagoons, and now they can start doing something with it, and something being turning it into methane. And I think I was reading in the Journal Sentinel a week or two ago that there's some new technology coming out of University of Wisconsin Oshkosh where they're going to be turning it straight into like jet fuel. And so
Wow.
the stuff is not, if earlier generations could look at a pile of bones and see riches or food on the table, we should be able to do that on a grander scale with these giant sized farms. So that's one area where I see, there's opportunity for everybody to move forward in a way that, keeps everybody fed. And
yeah, that is interesting though, because on the environmental movement, everyone looks at CAFOs and they are saying that they're bad, but you're right. If you can get them into a place now, if you can get them into this place and then somehow convince them to spend the extra money. But the truth of it is as a farm grows and can take care of their stuff, they do have the ability to reinvest to make things more efficient. And I think the tipping point there will come when the thing that's developed to help streamline the phosphorus or do it is when that's also an economic incentive for them as well as an environmental incentive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, farmers, they work their tails off and they're not getting rich, and they don't do it. They do it because that's what they love. And, it's such a rich part of our cultural heritage, and and there's a bunch of them. It's not like there's a few shippers. You're really getting at the fabric of Wisconsin here. And I'm in no means trying to disparage the work that they do. I just think that the system that's been set up right now isn't sustainable, and it would be hard to argue that it is. And when I say sustainable, I mean economically, but also critically environmentally, because once these lakes get this goop in it, it really is, it's death for dogs. It can be, and they become largely useless to humans. So there's costs to farming better. But there's tremendous benefits as well.
Yeah, it's almost, and I kind of just want to take it more broadly here now for sort of the last end of this. But we have so many environmental issues, going on around the world, whether it be climate change or phosphorus, invasive species, this and that. And I don't think that, I think we've done enough case studies to find out that people, by and large, it takes them a while to care. But if there's some, like, the thing that gets people really going is if somehow you can creatively see the net result you want and find some sort of economic solution to get there, that's going to go light years faster than because it's the right thing to do or whatever. And I almost think, like, for environmentalists listening to this, this is the way I've been trying to think, and I'm just curious your thoughts on it. Like instead of spending so much time trying to get people to care about climate change, maybe putting some of that time into figuring out how do we pull the carbon out of the atmosphere. But at the same time, as I'm saying that, doesn't make much sense, because the best thing we can do, do is just not put it out there to begin with. It's so hard to get people to care, I guess is the point.
Yeah, it is. And to get people to change too. Like one of the problems, and this is an intractable problem as far as I'm concerned, and I'm part of it. And that's our diets. And meat is just, it demands a lot of energy inputs and fertilizer inputs. And you go to these conferences and you hear these academics who make their lives work all about sustainable farming and phosphorus management. And they say it's really going to take a cultural change in the way our relationship with meat, and what, that's a gentle way of saying not so many hamburgers and brats and steaks, in our future. And that's a tough sell, and I don't know how we get around that. And with developing nations, getting increasingly wealthy, they're only naturally going to want similar diets or something more meaty, and so that's just going to compound the pressures on the system that is already not holding up so well. And I don't know what the answer to that is. Although I guess I kind of see it in my little anecdote here with my kids and their oatmeal. They're not doing it for any kind of political or economic reasons. They just developed a taste for it early on. But I don't know. I'm not banking on the rest of America's Dairyland coming along with that.
Yeah, I think as soon as you said oat milk, people were like, "Oh, oat milk, jeez." Yeah.
Well, I tease my kids. I'm like, "Have you ever seen this stuff made? They have to milk those poor oats."
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, it is something that, in Wisconsin, I mean, brats, cheese, all that stuff, milk, it's so ingrained and entwined in this culture. I don't know how that, or when that, there will come a time, if we keep on this trajectory, we just won't have the resources for any of it as humans. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So is there a way that you see us doing it more sustainably so we can enjoy brats for as long as we can? Or is that just something that people have to give up? What's the answer on that?
I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that, people aren't going to just, because it may be, in some abstract way in their mind, good for the environment, they're going to go for, what do they call that? Beyond. They're not going to have a soy burger instead of a chuck burger. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think you got to move in the real world and make modest and reasonable steps forward. And I think from my perspective, the most important thing for me is to get people to understand that the system that we have right now, where we're straight lining this circle of life and it's ending up with pollution in the waters, is not sustainable. And we're going to have to live within our means soon enough. I mean, I'm not saying 10 years, but it could be in 10 years, or it could be in 30 years, or it could be the end of the century. Who knows? There's so many problems coming at us. You can get overwhelmed thinking about, well, what's the solution? What can I do? What can we make other people do? And, I guess I'll be an optimist and think that stuff can work out if people get educated and they realize, the costs and the benefits to the current economic systems that we have, whether it's shipping and paper mills or dairy. I mean, we're really kind of in the hotbed, aren't we? As far as
yeah, we are. We are.
So many resources, and so economically and environmentally, and they're just sometimes on a collision course.
Well, and also you get into this weird thing where it can be industry versus industry. You have the fishing industries in the Gulf of Mexico are not happy with the farmers all the way up the Mississippi Basin because they see those dead zones, and that's what they're talking about. That's where it came from.
Yep.
And so, this stuff will come to a head. A big head, pretty soon. It's, do we want to get in front of it and try and do something? And there are a lot of people doing things, but I mean, I think in general, it's kind of dealing with that simple concept of the tragedy of the commons,
Mm-hmm.
and that's that once it's everybody's problem, it's not my problem,
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, you just got me thinking with the dead zone and the Gulf and the farms feeding that upstream. One thing that I think we can do is rethink the ethanol mandate that we have, because it blew me away doing some research for this phosphorus book that 40% of the corn we grow goes into ethanol. 50 some percent of the corn we grow in Iowa goes into ethanol, which is really, nobody's happy with that except for the industries that are benefiting handsomely from it, because ethanol can be hard on car engines and fuel efficiency. And it takes a lot of energy to make it. And, a lot of assessments say there really is no net environmental benefit to this stuff. It's neutral or it's a negative, and yet it persists. And it's just, you look at this and it's like, why is this persisting? And a big reason is, if you want to be president of the United States, you got to show well in Iowa, at the beginning of the campaign season. And you're not going to do well in Iowa if you don't, pledge allegiance to ethanol. And so those are some things. And, I'm trying not to be a political person in this book writing business, but there are some things that you think, well, this deserves, I'm not going to say do this or that. I'm going to say, take a hard look at this and see if you can think of something, you being politicians or academics, environmentalists, or industrialists. Look, is there a better, more efficient way? And I think with ethanol, most people would agree that there is, and that's to rethink the mandate.
Yeah, and that's one of those where you see, though we are so divided in these political times, there is one thing that everyone will agree on, and that's ethanol. And politically speaking, or I don't know a president ever who has gone against that. Is there someone who's made it to the White House who's
not to the White House? I think Ted Cruz in like 2008, 2012, he came out against ethanol in Iowa, which was interesting, and he still won narrowly, but he didn't.
Yeah, he did win
in Iowa. Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
Is this your next book? Is it on ethanol?
No. I mean, there's a lot of ethanol in this phosphorus book. I have no idea.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, but how
about you? What's your next book?
I don't know. But the ethanol thing, it fascinates me because, here's the thing with like farming. You don't want to piss off farmers because I know enough of them to know that they work their asses off. They know their land, they care for it, all this and that. And you don't want to lump all farmers into one category. And that's what they feel happens to them. So it's tough talking about ethanol, which is, they've done enough studies on it. We kind of get the deal now. We sort of see for what it is. It's only popular for a small portion of the population, and yet it drives so much of our current society, literally. So it's how do we get to that place? Because I feel like it happens again and again with our relationship to business and the environment, where the logical thing does not happen because we trade off short-term economic gains for long-term economic gains and environmental gains. That's just human nature, I think, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah, it is. And, I guess any kind of solution starts with an educated public and an educated body politic, which is becoming increasingly dicey.
It's educating the public, and then I feel like there's something else. It's almost like we have to change the way our brains are evolutionarily made, because though we have the logic to know that this is better for our children and our grandchildren, we still think like we're cavemen. We're like, just get me food today. Just get me money today. Just get me higher stock dividends or whatever that crap is today.
Yep.
That's what's driving our society.
Yeah. But then there are moments that you can have, a tectonic shift. And one of those was in the Great Lakes on Lake Erie, the Cuyahoga River, specifically when that caught fire in 1969.
Oh, yeah.
It actually caught fire a bunch of times before that. But something about that fire, just all of a sudden people just kind of like, they all looked up from, their busy days and like, what in the hell are we doing here? Water is burning. we've got to do something. And what we did was we got the Clean Water Act. And as I mentioned before, the paper companies are still churning out paper. I mean, we're still using toilet paper, and but now, we can fish in the water.
No, you're right. I mean, the Cuyahoga River is a perfect example for what I'm talking about, because how many times have we heard about climate change, or the dead zones or whatever it is? We've heard about it a million times. I forget that. They had the river caught on fire. And that wasn't even the worst fire in 1969, was it?
No, there was just something about that one burn. I mean, I think there was an awareness building and an ethic too. I mean, the Clean Water Act was passed under Nixon, and so it was a bipartisan issue. And so, people wonder what's the next Cuyahoga moment. And some people thought that this Toledo situation, where all of a sudden, wait a minute, we live next to 20% of the world's surface freshwater, and we can't turn on our faucets, and this is the whatever we're getting, the price is too high for this system. And there is, there in Wisconsin, there's a lot of farmers working with regulators up in Brown County in particular on better land use management practices. And in Ohio, there's taken some lawsuits, but they're moving toward, figuring out how to engineer a more sustainable agriculture system. So maybe sometimes it happens incrementally, but sometimes it takes a bad event or maybe a book,
Yeah.
to raise public awareness. Now that's a little self-centered of perspective, but Silent Spring did a lot to rein in. I mean, that's a big reason we got a lot of the environmental regulations. And I'm not by any stretch of the imagination comparing with the work that I'm doing to Rachel Carson's. She was a scientist, for example. But
No, but oh, go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off.
no, I mean, I just think, I think it's an incremental kind of process, and then all of a sudden something tips the scale, and that something in 1969 was the Cuyahoga River. And I don't know what it'll be for our modern agriculture system, but again, we've got to figure out a better way to do it, so we're not poisoning our waters to put food on our table, or ethanol in our tanks.
Yeah. And I think that nobody is getting down on farmers when they say that, but I think it's we all have to realize that we are all footing the bill for something. And when we're all paying for something that only somebody is benefiting from financially or by ease of doing their thing, well, that's not right either. So we're just trying to get to a more fair thing for everybody. But I think it's almost like once people start treating the commons kind of as their own, because we're in such an individualist society, so like once you start seeing as these things really impacting your like PFAS, for instance. I know we're wrapping up here, so I'll keep this quick, but PFAS is another good example of like, these are forever chemicals and they're forever in your water. One company made billions producing it, or multi-millions. I don't know how much they made. But then now we're paying for it because we're drinking these chemicals forever, because and at the same time, the PFAS are helpful in creating the things that they've created, just like phosphorus has given a lot of food. So it's all this double-edged sword stuff. It's just tough to navigate in the mind.
Yeah.
But not to muddy the waters, we do have to do something about it and make it more efficient. I don't want to say, well, there's nothing we can do. No, there's a whole lot that we can do.
Yeah, no, it all starts with just getting people to understand what's going on, why, and how we might be able to do it better, or why we should try to do it better.
Yeah.
And so that's a function of journalism, and it can be a function of all comedy. And, it's just, and like I said early on, when I wrote the Great Lakes book, I didn't want to put a black hat on anybody. I wanted to just explain the context of the decisions that were made that are having, a serious and dreadful effect on us today, and move forward from there. And yeah, it's not pointing fingers, it's shining lights. That's what
Yeah, and you wrote it in that way too, and I think I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. And by the way, where can people get your books? The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. That's a New York Times bestseller. And can you get them at the same place? Do you have a website?
I don't have a website, and the Phosphorus book will come out in March.
Oh, that's not out yet?
No, that's they call them advanced reader copies. So they,
Oh, that's
I don't know
awesome.
yeah, so that's just there's there's a lot. I don't know how many are out there floating, but there's a lot of typos and such, and it kind of
Oh,
kills me every
okay.
time I see them.
Well,
But
I'm not finished with that one yet, but I haven't noticed it, which says a lot about
okay,
me.
okay, good. Um, so that'll come out in March, and then the Great Lakes book, you can get it at any bookstore in town. I like Boswell's. That's not far from where I'm sitting in this car, but Amazon, the usual places.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome, man. Well,
Or
thank you.
or one you can find them probably all over the campus at UW because I'll leave you with this. I think it was 2018. They picked it as the big read, so every freshman got a copy of it, right?
Yeah.
And so there's like 7,000 freshmen or something, and then they bought like a double that for just university purposes, and that was more than I thought I'd ever sell to begin with. And so I felt pretty good. But then my daughter goes to school there. She was telling me, she's like, I call that a door stopper. You wouldn't believe where these books are ending up. So,
A literal door stopper.
hopefully it opened up a few eyes. But yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thanks for spending some time with us in your minivan by one of those Great Lakes. Appreciate you.
Thanks a lot, Charlie. Have a great day.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.